how we get that critical mass similar to what Occupy to confront, I think that's the next stage, is to confront something like the Democratic Party will be the next step. And it's one that hopefully, as this process continues to play out, as the system continues to decay, we see more people saying, yeah, no, we need to confront them, but we can't just elect somebody like AOC or Bernie Sanders to get the job done.
Danny Haiphong, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me again. I appreciate it and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you very much for being back on. So it's been about 2 years since last time you were on the show. So there's a lot that I wanted to talk about today and catch up on. But one reason that I want to have you on right now is because on Monday, I quit my job. I resigned from it after 2 years with the company. And I heard that you actually recently resigned from your job as well. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. We're kindred spirits in this way.
So for me, it was a little bit of animosity for me leaving my job. I was not enjoying it for a while and really just was staying on for the money. So, after a while of doing that, it just became too much. The company itself, I liked a lot of the people who worked there, but unfortunately the management was just terrible. The CEO was effectively just a rich kid who had the company handed to him by his father. The COO, he was just this guy that was not a good manager, not a good leader. He was abusive towards the staff. There was a lot of turnover at this company where over just the 2 years that I was there, we had many different people coming in and out of the company, being fired, resigning. It just was a terrible, terrible work environment. So eventually I just kind of couldn't take it anymore, decided to hand in my resignation on Monday. I likely would have been fired anyway, just given, how I was kind of voicing my criticisms to the leadership, which obviously you cannot do, even if you have, data to support the fact that they're making bad decisions. At least at this company, they were not receptive to that. That was my experience and the reasons why I left my company. I know that you worked in social work. What were kind of the reasons for you leaving that agency?
Well, there were many. For one, I think that the pandemic has taught millions of people that life is a little bit too short to remain at a job that doesn't really have any prospects for you, can't really secure your future, and really doesn't secure your present. And so in the social work profession, a so-called profession, most social workers experience their jobs as just another kind of precarious economy. Most social workers do not make living wages. The benefits aren't good enough to keep people around. And so turnover is just rife across the profession, but especially at a nonprofit agency like the one I was working at, there was just rampant turnover because the working conditions were so poor, because the productivity was so high and the pay was so low. And then you couple on a global public health crisis like COVID-19, and everyone goes remote, and still management is asking you to do just as much, if not more so, in emergency conditions where your work is limited and much more difficult to complete. And that also led to manager worker conflict in a lot of ways, very stressful conflicts. I was in a union, so at least there was a channel to try to negotiate and manage those conflicts. But even still, during a pandemic, right, I think a lot of the grievances among the millions of people who have decided to resign, and for millions upon more people who have been witnessing this experience or experiencing this crisis, they have wanted more from their government, from their employers, when the reality has been actually the opposite. Many employers have scaled way back, increased productivity incredibly. And of course, as you've been following, and as so many others have been following, the government, the state, the federal government, the Trump administration, Biden administration, has given very little to people in order to ensure their security. So for me, the reason was, well, the productivity is too high, the conditions are too stressful, the pay is too low, the benefits are not good enough. And even though I'm in a union, I didn't see any, union organizing is hard. We were going into contract negotiations. I left in the middle, and there was just no prospect for a better contract. Immediately the agency was saying, well, we'll renew the current contract. And that contract had just egregiously horrific terms, some of which were years old, decades old. And that was just a really bad sign. And like half the agency was remote, makes it very difficult to organize around a better contract. So I said, I really want to focus on my journalism work. It's something I've been doing for years now, for more than 8 years. And I would rather really focus on this kind of work, on political work, on media, on independent media, because I feel like that is where I belong right now because of all of what's been going on, a lot of which you've been covering on your channel.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people around the world have kind of felt the same way. This is something I kind of argued a little bit with Kim Iverson about when she was on the show, but I think that COVID really had people kind of take stock of their lives, evaluate, what they want to do with their lives, realize that life is short. We only have so much time on this planet. A pandemic or some kind of catastrophe could happen at any moment, and I think that a lot of people seem to have taken stock. I did personally, and this is part of my decision. Even though unfortunately, even after doing the show for 6 years, it doesn't pay the bills. So, it is kind of a gamble just to walk away from a job that is paying the bills. But at the same time, I'd kind of prefer to do things that I enjoy, do journalism, maybe work on other hobbies that I enjoy that could, make a little bit of money just to help cover costs. But, I think a lot of people around the world are kind of feeling the same way and leaving their job. And this is a headline that's kind of been in the news the last few months, is the Great Resignation. I don't know how much truth there is to this necessarily. I don't know if maybe it's being put out in the media for some reason, because it seems like it's been in the headlines a bit, but at least, based on those headlines, it seems as though there are millions of people in the United States, at least, who are now leaving their jobs.
Indeed. I think it was something like over 4 million workers left their jobs in September alone. I think that was the most recent figure that I saw. And I mean, that is that is something that is pretty rare given the state of the overall U.S. economy. There's a level of precarity in the United States that has not been seen since the 30 years crisis and the Great Depression in the United States. And so people leaving their jobs, some of course on the right, and those who in neoliberals, all the establishment, they like to say, well, it's because the government is giving handouts right now. Most states have scaled back unemployment significantly. There really isn't a boost anymore. The Biden administration has not been keen on extending some of the very half-hearted and modest measures just to keep people from burning down society, essentially. That was certainly all the COVID relief that we received over the last year and a half, 2 years. And so I think that this really does speak to this Great Resignation. Some people are equating it to kind of like a soft strike, that workers, they don't have the organized basis to conduct a militant strike, one that's organized and one that can kind of mobilize workers across industries, but still the sentiment is there that individual workers are making a choice that they don't want to work like this anymore, and that they'll find their way how they can. And I think it does offer an opportunity to begin to talk about, well, this only really does increase even though it's kind of like a collective action, it does increase the relative isolation, the atomization of the working class that's been going on for quite a while with the gig economy and, the high tech sector, and the ways in which that has separated workers from each other in some ways, while pushing a lot of workers into service industry jobs and in certain jobs that are very socialized, but so precarious that organizing is very difficult. But nonetheless, I think we are seeing an opportunity to begin to talk about, well, what will organizing workers look like in the 2021 and in the future, now that we are kind of in this quote unquote new normal, where workers really don't want to be putting their lives at risk at the workplace. They do not want to be working for shit salaries and wages, $15 an hour or less. You know, that's even $15 an hour isn't enough to make it anymore. So I think with public sentiment kind of moving in this direction of wanting certain universal programs like a Medicare for all, and with workers going kind of on this soft strike, I really do hope that we can have more conversations about, well, what do we do now? Because it's great if we all start to engage in what we want to do, but there is this bigger problem of what this signifies, which is that conditions for working people are being driven to the point where there really isn't a reason to hold most jobs in the United States. And those jobs that are worthwhile, they're very limited. And so that increases competition, and that will lead to other problems. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking about now that we have this scenario. COVID-19 kind of gave us this new reality piled on top of very old realities.
And I think that the examples that people are seeing most in their day-to-day lives are these fast food chains shutting down. Because I see continually in my Facebook feed people posting that this Dunkin' Donuts, this Burger King, this Taco Bell isn't open today. The staff left some note, or the management left a note that they didn't have enough people to work. And I think that recently there was a video circulating on Twitter of a Wendy's where the staff just all left.
So how this happened at my Wendy's. So I'm not going to tell you all the boring shit that led up to this, but basically what had happened was COVID happened, a couple months went by, everyone realized how shit it was, and everyone quit. I lost my AGM, my GM, and about 6 shift managers. I was a shift manager at the time, and after they all quit, I got promoted to an AGM. I had no GM for about 3 months, and I was working 85 hours a week, every week with no day off, basically them whole 3 months. And I made $14.77 as an AGM, keeping this store up and running. I eventually got a new GM. She came in and completely ruined this place within 2 weeks. The 34 people that I had on my schedule all basically wanted to quit, and I was just tired of it. No upper management helped me at all throughout those 3 months I was by myself. I did it all alone. And one day I just came in and I said I've had enough and I couldn't do it anymore. So I told everyone, and about me and 17 other people quit that day. We didn't clean up. We closed down about 8 o'clock at night. We made a little taco bar and we left it a mess.
So, I mean, I think this is a real key example, and where I think you are even seeing the workers coordinating to say, this is enough, we're all walking out of here. Do you think that, these kind of service industry, or even specifically fast food jobs, that these could really be on the forefront of, maybe pushing back against low wages and some of these terrible working conditions?
Indeed. I mean, that's where it's going to have to happen in the United States. I mean, the United States does not have a industrial working class like it once did, even though the South of the United States still has some. But those jobs, when Alabama and Texas, for example, they tend to be just as poor in terms of their working conditions as a retail job in the Northeast or on the West Coast, where you're making minimum wage at best, and you have all of these other issues like wage theft and the fact that you do not have benefits, so that makes your wages even lower. And so I think it is very promising that there is a sense of collectivity to this, that you do have workers saying, yeah, we're not going to work here, we're going to quit, and we're going to find our way somewhere else. I think the key issue for us is, okay, then how do we now make this a political act, make this one where there is a political significance to it, in the sense that there is a direct challenge to the establishment and that these workers are motivated not just to vote for someone in the election who claims that they're going to fight for living wages and Medicare for all, but how do we get workers themselves to be directly activated to fight for those things and to make sure that they happen. I think that really is the next step in certainly the service industry, which is massive in the United States. I mean, huge. And many service industry workers have not had a quarantine. They haven't had a break. They were labeled quote unquote essential and kind of left to their own devices, which I think really has precipitated this mass quitting in a lot of ways, because it was like there was even less protection, right? A lot of workers like myself and others, people could say, employers could say, well, you can work from home. We'll make you work a lot harder from home, but you can work from home. Most service workers were not able to do that, and a lot of them died. A lot of them died. A lot of them got sick. A lot of them ended up working an intense amount to survive, and were without a lot of the protections or even these half-hearted, modest measures that others were able to access.
Why do you think it is that these companies are not responding to this great resignation? And again, in the case of stores closing or restaurants closing, why do you think it is that they're not already raising wages? Because I've seen people posting for jobs as well on social media, and we're hiring for $14 an hour to come work at the grocery store. Like who's gonna accept that? Especially in some states where that really will not pay your rent, that won't pay for hardly, that won't pay for your groceries, ironically. But why are they not responding to this? And can they not afford to? Because we're even seeing CVS now closing a lot of their stores. Do you think that maybe it's possible that some companies just can't afford to raise their wages, so that they're rather just closing their stores?
Well, I think these huge multinational corporations, those that really dominate the United States' particular capitalist economy, certainly have the profit, certainly have the margins to be able to afford even the slightest of wage increases, if not significant wage increases. The problem resides in the fact that capitalism is a fundamentally irrational system. And one of the largest contradictions, most important contradictions about capitalism is that not only is profit maximization the sort of religious doctrine of the system, but also competition amongst these monopolies, which always are an inevitable fact of capital and capitalism, that now there is this sort of face-to-face confrontation with the limitations of capital, in the sense that competition is literally creating these huge monopolies, and now none of them want to do what is necessary to ensure their own survival, because they are afraid of what that kind of example would set across the broader capitalist marketplace. So if, let's say, CVS raises wages, CVS is now worried about Rite Aid or some other huge pharmacy or competitor not doing this and actually benefiting from it in terms of profit share, etc. So this is where I think the irrationality of the system comes through, in the sense that capital would rather eradicate itself than to cut into the profit margins of their corporations. And I think this is so important to understand, because we are at a moment where the monopolization, this imperialist system now has become so concentrated, wealth has become so concentrated, that actually the fierce competition amongst these monopolies ends up tightening and ends up becoming more and more limited. And now we have corporations unwilling to even allow the government, because a lot of the reasons why we do not have Medicare for all, we don't have some of the things that would have provided a great amount of relief in this period of crisis don't exist, because these very same corporations are even more afraid than they ever have been of what such an example like that would serve and would sort of function, and how it would impact their capacity to further the rate of exploitation, exacerbate the exploitation of workers, both in the United States and abroad. And so I think that is what we're seeing. We're seeing capital literally eviscerating itself, all so that capitalists can continue to run away with record profits and continue to maintain the system as it currently exists and as it's existed for many, many centuries, just at now a different stage of its life. And I think COVID-19 was such a great example of how this system has kind of reached its ultimate limitations. It's reached its most significant limitations thus far in its history.
Yeah, on the subject of the government, that's something that I've been asking guests for the last several months, because again, we've seen these extra COVID unemployment benefits going away. We've seen the eviction moratorium being rolled back. And in February, the thing that I think is really going to put a major strain on the economy is when student loan payments resume. And you have 45 million people in the country who are, which is one out of every 5 adults in the US is going to have to start making effectively another mortgage payment that they haven't been making for 2 years. So I can only imagine what that's going to look like. And I kind of struggled with why would the government, and specifically, why would the Democratic Party let this happen? Because it looks like this is just going to contribute to them getting destroyed next November in the elections, I would imagine, especially if you have the economy crashing in Q1 or early Q2 of next year. Do you think that maybe it is a case of these companies wanting to exert pressure on workers to effectively make them stop calling for higher wages?
Yes, and I think that this is where the banks come in and where finance capital comes in, because when you have this level of concentration and monopolization in a capitalist economy, it means that you have finance capital really pulling all of the strings, really being in the vanguard of the economy, so to speak. And so there is an intense amount of pressure being placed on all sides of the establishment by finance capital to ensure that these payments continue. And we have Joe Biden, who of course is a product of the credit industry and a huge recipient of Wall Street money. He really doesn't have a huge interest in ensuring that these payments are delayed further. Forget about forgiveness. I think that is completely off of the table. And I think all of the political hand wringing over that very question just demonstrates how we're not going to get any significant level of student loan forgiveness without an intense level of struggle among people to demand it. So I think that the banks are really literally banking on these payments to come through so that they can expand their own already bloated profit margins that they have really they've really taken advantage of the precarity of people. Debt continues to increase among working people. And when you have this relationship of finance capital literally crediting people their standard of living, and then that makes crises like COVID-19 even more profitable, because if people don't have money, then they need to seek credit in order to survive. And this helps keep the system going while at the same time creating, as you kind of alluded to, the rudiments and really the foundations for another monumental financial crash, another monumental economic crisis, which will come, and it will come likely sooner than later, given all this inflation talk, all of the talk over the last year and a half of people's economic livelihoods being so decimated. That also speaks to a fundamental contradiction of capital and capitalism, which is the higher the rate of exploitation of the working class, the less capacity that capital has to reproduce itself, because the very goods, the very products, the capital that's circulating in the system eventually has nowhere to circulate because workers aren't buying it. Wealth is being gobbled up and concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. And so you have massive waste and massive glut. And then what does capital do? It says, well, we can't go on like this. So a crash happens, a crisis of confidence, and then you have capital kind of on a sort of predatory conquest to recoup all of its losses, which means high unemployment and all of that. So I think we're really headed there. In the student loan crisis, the student debt crisis, I'm part of that. I have student loans. Anyone who's been to university at this point in the United States likely has significant amounts of student loans.
I think it's 1/3 of people under the age of 30 at this point.
Exactly. And so, yeah, I certainly don't plan on paying these loans. So there's a lot of,
you can't. I mean, that's the ridiculous thing. It's reached the point where people are starting their lives with debts that they cannot pay. Like millions and tens of millions of people in this country. Like, it's just I don't know, it's absurd. And again, I just kind of wonder, because these people aren't stupid, right? Like, they're evil, obviously, the people who run these banks and these politicians. Like, they're sociopaths, but they're not stupid. So, like, there has to be a breaking point, right, where they have to start giving more crumbs. Like, you can't have prices rising with wages not rising, with if anybody does have any money in the bank, with that being devalued by inflation. And again, like these welfare measures or these unemployment benefits and whatnot being rolled back at the same time. Like, eventually you're going to reach a point where things are going to go in the direction of a great resignation, or even further, where people are going to be rioting at some point. We're even seeing there's in some cases, like, just groups of people showing up at certain stores and just looting them and expropriating the wealth from these stores.
Tonight, a rash of smash and grab thefts targeting retailers around the country, just as the holiday shopping season picks up. In California, the Bay Area suddenly seeing mobs of people ambushing stores.
A lot of them are going in there, grabbing as much merchandise as they can and getting away.
Over the weekend in Walnut Creek, 80 thieves storming a Nordstrom. Some even assaulting employees before they ran out with merchandise in hand to getaway cars.
Probably saw 50 to 80 people in like ski masks, crowbars, like a bunch of weapons.
And in San Francisco, more than $1 million in merchandise was stolen after as many as 100 people rushed several stores, including this Louis Vuitton.
Look, I have no sympathy, no empathy whatsoever. People smashing and grabbing, stealing people's items, creating havoc and terror on our streets.
I think that you're probably going to see more and more of that. And like, they have to be aware of that, right? Like, how bad are they willing to let things get?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that it's very unpredictable. I think what is predictable is that with this endless austerity and with a finance capital kind of at the helm and really in control, we do know that the response to these crises will be more about management and will be more about how to push through this kind of austerity in ways that are palatable. And so any kind of reform measures will include, as we've seen over the last couple of years, very means-tested temporary solutions, if anything at all. And so the fact that we even have this question being asked, I think, demonstrates just how sociopathic and just how irrational this system is and has always been. But I think the difference now is that we have reached a point in history where the struggle of working class people is arguably more disorganized, not necessarily less progressive or more progressive. I think we do have a pretty significant wave of progressive sentiment, of left political sentiment. It's just not organized in a way to really capture the attention of the establishment that brings significant change. And so I think that is the factor that I'm always most interested in, is what are people doing? I think the Great Resignation is a huge aspect of this to pay attention to. But then we also have to pay attention to, and then what is the organized activity? I mean, we see strikes happening. A lot of them are happening on an individual employer by employer basis, which, while it can maybe secure a good contract for one particular union local, usually, it may be the entire international, aka national union. It might not have, it usually does not have the significance to influence the behavior of employers across the board. So how do we get to a point where that's something we can do, is something that I think is really at the forefront here. Because yes, the capitalists, capital, finance capital, the politicians that they ultimately pull the strings of, they're not stupid. They are negotiating all of this. They're trying to figure out how to manage this in a way that maintains all of the benefits of their system. I think the fact of the matter is that they can't always control the consequences of this system, right? And I think that is where we need to come in to kind of explain that, so that people don't feel powerless, right? In terms of this grand establishment that can't be fought. So people don't feel powerless, but also then we can turn our attention to, okay, then how do we generate the activity and the power and the movement to create and make these changes?
Well, I think that one of the ways that the elite have really been effective is in controlling the narrative and disrupting the left. I mean, obviously the left in the United States is just effectively in shambles, and you have kind of controlled opposition who are gaslighting different subsets within the left in different ways. And I think that this is a major barrier to any kind of class solidarity that's going to create a real labor movement and have any kind of organized activity. So I mean, how do we get past that when you have, again, just like the major, not just politicians, not just the Democratic Party, but like when you have major left-wing outlets like again, like TYT, Democracy Now, The Intercept, even to some degree I would say Mother Jones and Jacobin, when you have them kind of gaslighting the left and creating divisions in the left, having people fighting with each other, even attacking folks who are trying to organize a general strike and deriding them, saying that they're being ridiculous trying to organize a general strike. How do we overcome that? Because again, it just seems as though the left in the US is just completely fractured.
Yeah, I mean, that is the reality, and it becomes important to call this out and to raise it to the realm of public and popular debate, right? So one of the things that's so challenging in this moment is the fact that the Democratic Party, and the Republican Party has elements of this too. We see it with the so-called populist right, for example, right? We have elements across the board in the establishment that are seeking to channel the sentiments and energies of working people into avenues that are acceptable to capital. Because if you're being channeled into the populist right, the GOP, as you are the Democrats, capital wins, because who controls those political parties? It's capital. So I think the challenge here is to then be very consistent, right? So for us as journalists, I see our role as ensuring that when opportunities arise and when the moment is correct, that we are criticizing, we are putting out into the public sphere the fact that, yes, Democracy Now, especially on the question of imperialism, the United States spending trillions on war, Democracy Now will often flank to the right and support U.S. intervention in Syria in a very, I won't even call it subtle, but in a very kind of nefarious manner to kind of confuse those who should be on the side of working people against war. While you also have Democrats who have very close relationships with most union leadership in the United States. So that needs to be exposed, and that needs to be contended with. Like, we can't ignore that reality. And so we are at a point where there's been such a retreat on the left, and all the steps that have been made forward have at some level at least in the final analysis, despite all the good work that I know people on the grassroots are doing, whether it's Black Lives Matter, the Bernie, the Sandernistas, as we call them at Black Agenda Report, the Sanders supporters, a lot of which came out of Occupy Wall Street. But there has been this general co-optation of major forces within these developments, which has ensured the reality that you speak of, this fracturing of the left and its ultimate destruction and death, so to speak, within the Democratic Party. And so I think, of course, number one, we need to find a way to be independent of the Democratic Party, both politically, whether we're talking about elections and how we address that arena of political struggle, but also just in a broad sense in any kind of political activity that we're doing, journalism, organizing, that needs to be independent of the Democratic Party. That needs to be independent of their funding structures. And that means having really difficult conversations and starting from a really difficult point, right? A point of recognizing in some respect, powerlessness, but at the same time, understanding that the only way to gain power is through the people. It can't be through corporations. It cannot be through their conduits, political, nonprofit, non-governmental organizations, whatever it is. It can't be through them, because if it is, then we run into not just barriers, but new problems, right? Because we have new problems over the last 5 decades or so. We didn't have a nonprofit industrial complex 5 decades ago. We didn't have, this. We had it to some degree, but we didn't have this intense merger between the labor leadership in the U.S. and the Democratic Party. We also didn't have a situation where the Democratic Party has been able to kind of siphon the most militant energy from like the anti-war movement or the Black movement into its large graveyard, right? We didn't have that problem, but now we do. And so old problems have led to new problems, which now I think requires us to be even more vigilant. So if we're in journalism, we need to be even more vigilant about our coverage, our analysis of the function of the Democrats, the function of the two-party system, the function of journalists who astroturf for the establishment. And then we need, on the side of grassroots organizing, we need folks to be willing and ready to confront those forces within, right? Not just the external forces, not just the establishment, right? I think we can mobilize a whole lot of people, there's a whole lot of disillusionment with the two-party establishment. But where the limitations really arise is where you have people on the left claiming they're on the left within, whether it's nonprofits, whether it's in certain levels of leadership in the labor movement, but they're not fighting for us. They're fighting ultimately to reproduce their own privileged positions within the system. So I think that's it's a really difficult way forward, but I do see that as the only way forward is confronting these contradictions head on.
I think that the biggest challenge for people on the actual left, the anti-imperialist left, the labor movement left, is that you get smeared and slandered in a variety of different ways, either as being a secret right-winger. This happened to me recently. TYT went after me to say that I was right-wing. For calling them out, really, I kind of got under their skin for showing how they have been influenced by Jeffrey Katzenberg, how Anna Kasparian, while Jeffrey Katzenberg was lobbying the LA City Council to pass anti-camping laws, she started ranting against the homeless on TYT. And this kind of got under their skin for a while. So, similar to what they've done to Jimmy Dore or Max Blumenthal, saying that, we're all really on the right. And meanwhile, they from a billionaire funded media outlet are, they're the real left. So you have that on one hand. You also have people being called foreign agents, people like Aaron Mate saying that he's working for Russia in Syria. And, you have other people, like people who say, I'm a communist. You have them being labeled as Nazbols or, participating in this horseshoe theory, red-brown alliance. Yes. So there's just a wide variety of ways that people on the actual left are being kind of demonized and discredited. And again, I feel like there's a very prevalent trend of trying to gaslight anyone who might be interested in hearing alternative perspectives outside of the Democratic Party, trying to say, no, anyone who does not fall in line behind the Democratic Party, they're a foreign agent, or they're really a right winger, they're the bad guys for some reason. So again, how do you overcome that? Is it just going to be from the fact that their own contradictions are so apparent, or just the fact that things are getting so bad economically in the US that people stop trying to stop voting for Republicans and Democrats? Like, what's going to be the final breaking point to get past that?
Well, I think it'll be a combination of things. I think what you mentioned is certainly part of it. I also see that our own work in, of course, stepping up to the challenges and the slander that we are receiving. And, to be honest, most of them come from the liberal class. And so this class,
they're all like millionaires.
Exactly. So this class has a huge interest in this red-brown alliance. I consider this like horseshoe theory slander to be a very, one of the most dangerous things that we can confront right now, because it does have a pretty salient impact on people's consciousness, and it does fit within this broader establishment narrative that people hear every day about the US under siege, right? Russia, China, elections, all of that, Russiagate. We can go down the line of all of the conspiracies that are floating around, pushed by the establishment, which ultimately come back on us, and so for me personally, I've been labeled like agent of the Communist Party of China, whatever, various things like that. And I think that it really serves so many important purposes to the elite. And it really is, for those who consider themselves on the left and who are regurgitating this, it really is just carrying water for the State Department. It is really just carrying water for the establishment, because that's where these narratives ultimately originate from. So it really is this kind of telephone where the establishment says something, slanders the left, and the so-called progressives in the media, liberal class, they just repeat it. And so I think the breaking point will be many things. What you mentioned, their illegitimacy, as well as the fact that things are getting so bad that people kind of just tune it out. I think a lot of that has happened, because I do think that when we tell the truth amid all of the lies, it just so happens that we gain more of a foothold. And that's why we have the more concrete censorship that I think is even more dangerous, in the sense of social media and these platforms, YouTube, etc., literally using the tools at their disposal to block, silence, and marginalize our voices. That really is, I think, the most dangerous outcome of this, because it presents real material barriers beyond just the propagandistic barriers of the liberal class carrying water for these corporations. So I do think all of those factors will play a role in shifting the narrative. And I do also think that one of the things that's produced by conditions becoming so dire for people is that you will have more moments of literal rebellion, and I don't think we've seen this on an economic basis just yet, right? Because I think the biggest rebellion we've had in the economic sense in the last 5 years has been those who supported Bernie Sanders. But we did have the rebellions in the streets in 2020 around racist policing that stemmed from many years of smaller rebellions. And I think we're going to continue to see that. And that pushes the establishment narrative even further to the right, which then gives more room, I think, for us to kind of hit the center, because that's really our job, right? The far right, they're going to do their thing, and they're not organizing leftists, although they're trying at this point. They're trying a little harder, but it's really the Democrats who are in the liberal class who present the greatest threat to any kind of resurgent left in the United States. And it will be, I think, our opportunity when these spontaneous rebellions arise for us to gain even more traction than before, than we have now, in a moment where, there's been a crisis, but there isn't a lot of activity on the ground beyond, these employer by employer strikes, significant as they are, to shift the political narrative. And so I think there will be more opportunities in the very near future. We shouldn't change our behavior now for that, but more opportunities for us to continue to figure out how do we build alternative institutions, independent institutions, which I know some are trying to do, so that our message is more effective and reaches more people and ultimately builds the kind of leaders, grassroots leaders, that we need to get us out of this mess.
Yeah, on the subject of censorship, you were censored on Twitter for basically repeating a tweet to Keith Olbermann that he put out, right? Like just kind of inverting it and saying it back to him.
Yep. Yeah. So essentially, Keith Olbermann attacked Wyatt Reed, called him a whore for dictator, referencing Wyatt was in Nicaragua covering the elections there, and showed images of, the kind of electoral campaign that was going on, the FSLN and the opposition, kind of saying, look, there's a real democratic process happening here. And that was Keith Olbermann's response. My response to him was, that he was whoring for capital, that's what he does. And I said that, how does it feel to be ratioed? Because that's what you do. And immediately, it was very quick. It was so quick that I didn't even have the chance to check the tweet again. I think I stepped away to use the bathroom or something from my phone, and came back a couple minutes later, and I had an email from Twitter saying, you've been reported for violating Twitter rules around discrimination regarding race, gender, religion, all that. And
but you said exactly what he said. Like it was the exact same thing that Keith Olbermann said.
Exactly. I used the same word, whore, and mind you, of course, I guess that's politically incorrect in some respects in this point in time, but at the same time, I've seen worse stuff said on Twitter.
But it's not like you chose the word. You were repeating what he said.
Exactly. I didn't choose the word. It was pretty obvious what I was doing. Subtlety is a difficult thing, I know, for some people on Twitter, but that was what was happening. And yeah, I was reported, who knows by who. I think it was Keith Olbermann, but given how quick it was, but given the fact that he would take the time to reply to Wyatt Reed, who, Wyatt is a prolific journalist and a comrade of mine, but certainly, very rarely does someone like Wyatt or myself or anyone else get attention from someone like him on social media. And so I think, that was what happened. I had two choices, right? Twitter gave me two choices. They said, you can delete the tweet and serve your 12-hour jail sentence or whatever, or you can write to us the appeal process, knowing that, and they're very explicit about this, knowing that we don't have any time frame for when we'll respond, and in that time, regardless of our answer, your account will remain suspended. And I've tried to get verified. I've been rejected over and over and over again. So I don't even really try anymore, but I know how long it takes for Twitter to respond to things. So I was like, you know what? I'll just have to delete the tweet. And I think that is just a very small microcosm of what censorship is, right? Like literally you are the one who has to change your behavior because a corporation didn't like what you had to say. Meanwhile, these corporations and people and their handlers like Keith Olbermann can say whatever the hell they want and there's no consequences. So I think that
we saw that
to this.
We saw that with Russiagate too. It was 5 years of nonstop lies being disproven over and over and over again. Did any of the corporate media networks who spread all of those lies, or people like Rachel Maddow, did any of them ever get censored on social media?
Nope, they didn't. Not only that, but most of them didn't even have to offer any retractions. And when the corporate media, the print media, the New York Times, for example, Associated Press, when they offered retractions for things like Russiagate or whatever it is, China, anti-China propaganda, whatever it is, whenever they offered retractions, it was always much later after the story had already had its impact and the piece remained up, right? It wasn't like they removed the article altogether. It's they put at the very end of the article, oh yeah, this little fact was not correct and we're correcting it now, but the damage has been done. And so I think that just speaks to the hypocrisy and really the power relationship that censorship has at its core, which is that it's the powerful who are doing the real censoring. Oftentimes we're talking about each other as if we're like censoring each other or whatever, but the powerful are really the ones who are canceling people, who are managing the narratives and are managing how people perceive the most pressing problems that are facing us as human beings right now. And I think that's really the scariest part of it, because I mean, look at what's happening to Julian Assange, just for exposing the realities of so many things, not least the war crimes of the United States and its allies, and not least the fact that the U.S. political system is rigged for corporations and banks. But he is being targeted for death, extermination, or life imprisonment, which is akin to that.
Just to go back to what we were talking about earlier, I think that a lot of these different outlets on the supposed left, TYT, Democracy Now, The Intercept, Mother Jones, Jacobin, they've all, I don't think any of them have been censored either, right? So along with their adoption of imperialist talking points, I think that's just another example of, another tell that they've been co-opted by the establishment.
Yeah, and it keeps them going. I mean, taking positions like Nicaragua during the Guarimbas, for example, where Democracy Now! Was supporting that US-backed coup attempt, to do so really helps some Democracy Now! Remain funded and remain relevant and remain uncensored, right? So I think
they're not relevant to me. They were relevant to me 15 years ago. They aren't anymore.
Exactly. Well, relevant to the people that they care about, which is, I think, more so now the liberal class and those folks that can continue to support them while negating left politics essentially for I think a lot of it is kind of a calculation, even if it's unconscious, of, well, yeah, because things like Democracy Now, people, I know Noam Chomsky has taken certain positions over the years that I totally disagree with on questions of imperialism. There's others. But I think there is, when you have people who do know better, right, but tend to completely contradict their principles, then it's a question of what's the calculation, and the calculation is that, okay, if I take certain positions, then I won't get the heat. And I think that's one of the things that censorship does, and that this political repression in the realm of ideas really does on the part of the establishment, is it helps bring out these divisions and makes them difficult, so that now we not only have the establishment to counter, to challenge, to try to debunk and criticize, but now we also have kind of this buffer between ourselves and the establishment. And that in between us happens to be, yes, the Democrats, people who consider themselves left of Democrat, Democracy Now! Followers, Sanders followers, and they are also, big believers in things like Russiagate and things like, the propaganda in China or Syria, right? And that creates another barrier to peace, to like a real peace movement. And so no matter how you look at it, in front of us is this liberal class and those who are kind of towing the line of, am I liberal, am I left? And they kind of serve as a buffer between us and the establishment to be able to really get our message out and to have it make a more significant impact than what we're already doing.
I think that that's something that really does help distinguish the actual left from this fake pseudo controlled opposition left, is the fact, again, that they're just adopting all of these imperialist talking points. And I think that, if there is any escalation of of military intervention in Syria, for example, or if things really do start getting heated over Taiwan, that this will really be an example of who the actual left is and who the controlled opposition is.
Exactly, because it really speaks to are you prepared or are you not to oppose that? Are you prepared to act in unison in opposition to war? So if you are going on your program, whether, I don't know, I know Breaking Points, I often get DMs about that, or whether it's Democracy Now! And it's just like, here is the mainstream media State Department position on questions like Syria and China, and you're just regurgitating that. There's no debate, there's no counter. Then your audience is now being primed to believe you and thus behave in a certain way in the future when there really is a crisis. I mean, I consider the situation a real crisis now when you have the US occupying 30% of Syria, have 400 military bases on the doorstep of China. I mean, that's a real literal crisis now. But should that escalate, now we're not even prepared to oppose the most egregious forms of military intervention a la Iraq, Afghanistan, like in 2001. I think this kind of speaks to the dissolution and dismemberment of the anti-war movement, which is a reflection overall of progressive and left politics. Like, you cannot be a leftist and claim and support claims from imperialists. Like, you can't do that, because
that's what they've been doing for 5 years with Russiagate.
Exactly. And it's in direct contradiction to everything that you say you stand for. Because if you stand for truth, but you support Russiagate, then you support lies and you support a conspiracy theory. Same thing goes with the chemical weapons in Syria, genocide in China. We can go down the line, right? There's just examples of this all over the place. But if you're just adopting these narratives, which all come from very nefarious establishment-backed sources, then you are in fact just contradicting your entire agenda, because it's not just about, okay, we're for peace as a single issue. It's about how that narrative ultimately drives policies which create the very reality that you say you're fighting. Like, this massive austerity regime would not be possible without the endless militarization of the world, this endless war regime on the United States. It wouldn't be possible. It wouldn't be that, I think, is often missing from the analysis and the narrative. And so exactly as you said, it is what this so-called pseudo left, the so-called progressives have been doing in many respects, and that needs to be called out more and more so now and in the future.
So these social media networks, they really weren't around, when there was major opposition to the Iraq War. And although we've had many different military, interventions over the years, over the last decade or so, they haven't been as big as something like the Iraq War. Do you think, again, like, if we were to put troops on the ground in Syria more than they are now, if we were to really intervene in Syria, or again, like if something serious does happen, if a war breaks out over Taiwan, do you think that we're going to see real censorship over people's foreign policy views on social media?
Oh, for sure. I mean, 100%. There's no doubt about it. It brings me back to 2013, that summer when Barack Obama was threatening to, bomb Syria over the so-called red line of chemical weapons. There was this kind of wave of anti-war sentiment, and there were pretty big demonstrations. I was in Boston at the time, and the demonstrations were much bigger than any other anti-war rally I'd ever been to prior to that. I was a little too young to go to the Iraq demonstrations and all that growing up. But even then, the Obama administration's FBI was censoring censoring accounts, especially of Syrian people, Syrian Americans. And they had released a message saying that, yeah, we are going to monitor the activities of Syrians in the United States and anti-war groups, in order to ensure that the situation is whatever, stable, or whatever speak that they use, professional speak they use to try to legitimize what they're doing. And when I went to when I went to the demonstration, not only did you have like an incredible amount of provocateurs literally splitting the marches, but you also had like drones, like small drones flying in the air, spying on people. It was very intense. So at any moment when the United States is ready to, there will be another moment, is ready to topple another so-called regime, is ready to topple a government, is ready to go all in on a certain military project, we should expect that the repressive apparatus here in the United States will become even more repressive, that the state will clamp down on social media, it will clamp down on protests, on opposition. That should be expected, because at this point, when we look at the global situation, all the particular hot points where the US may do such a thing, may, turn a proxy war into a hot war, or a cold war into a hot war, they have such global significance that we can almost guarantee that there will be a global confrontation that's more collective, a la another world war, right? Because you can't intervene in Syria without Russia and China also stepping in and saying, hey, what are you doing? You're in our region. You're same thing with Taiwan. When it comes to China, same thing, even in Latin America, you have, I don't ever foresee a direct military intervention in Latin America, given its proximity. But even then, you have this global situation where Latin America is so interconnected with the rest of the world that you can't help but draw in other forces. And that, I think, creates even more of an impetus to clamp down and to suppress any kind of activity opposing these moves, should they arise. And they will arise, because I do think that although there isn't an anti-war movement that's strong right now, and a lot of that has to do with the form of war and the way war has changed, and how the progressive movement, the left, has been so decimated over the years, there isn't really an appetite, right? There wasn't an appetite in 2013 for Obama to invade. There just wasn't. And I can expect that should the tables turn on any one of these questions, that sentiments will rapidly change. All the polls say, yeah, everyone's for like an invasion of Taiwan, right? I don't see that as being 100% truthful, given who takes the polls, who's administering the polls. It doesn't really reflect political reality. I don't think you'll have many people in the United States supporting a direct military intervention against China. That would sacrifice so many people, and also the economic, any kind of economic stability that exists in the U.S., whatever it is, whatever little it is. I don't think people will want to sacrifice that either. So I think that's where repression becomes more important, all the more important.
Again, I think it just begs the question of how severe these contradictions can become, again, because I think we've reached the point now where people understand that they're being censored on social media. I think that in the Julian Assange case in particular highlights how press freedom is dead, but just how restricted do people have to be, or how censored do people have to be before, it's really clear that we don't have freedom of speech, we don't have any real First Amendment rights?
I mean, that's another good question, because this free speech debate is very hot. People wear it as a badge. And I think, as I wrote in our book on American exceptionalism, that, there really hasn't ever been free speech in the United States, given the United States' history, given its class character. There's always been a significant element of repression that characterizes what we do. And a lot of that really falls on those who decide that they don't want to live like how they're living, whether we're talking about the Black movement, whether we're talking about the labor movement, whether we're talking about the media and the intellectuals and the activists that participate in those movements. And so I think now we're in a situation where the movements are at a low point. We don't have a significantly strong left right now. And so there tends to be, this conflation of being able to say what you want, no matter how restricted you are in saying it, as somehow being reflective of free speech, as opposed to, and this is where foreign policy, this is where imperialism is so important, as opposed to like Russia or China, where those countries are portrayed as like hellscapes for free speech, where you can't say what you want or you'll be like arrested or something.
Like Julian Assange.
Exactly, like Julian Assange, or yeah, exactly, and all the whistleblowers, Daniel Hale, all of them who have tried to expose truths. I think that's where we see this contradiction really playing out, and a lot of it happens on a partisan basis. And I think both political parties have this interest in promoting their own kind of versions of what free speech looks like, right? So, for the Democrats, it's like free speech is just like representation, diversity, and like we can suppress and we can support mass incarceration, we can jail Julian Assange, but as long as we like kind of look like the general population, then that reflects the freedoms of the United States. Well, the GOP has their more, I would say, like crass, conservative, flag waving version of free speech, like the founders, the slave owners, all those folks. They were all about free speech, and that's what makes us different. It's a kind of like a racialized free speech. Like that's what makes us different from Russia and China.
It's like being anti-woke, but you can't burn the flag.
Exactly, right. Anti-woke, but imprisoning someone and nearly killing them, and the death penalty and all these things have no bearing on free speech. Loving the police, all of that, no bearings on it. Corporate control of journalism, no bearings on free speech. All of the things that we've been talking about kind of get negated by the GOP and their handlers, while the Democrats support the very same policies and kind of reflect a different version of what it means to have this society where people can supposedly say what they want without state consequences. And the Democrats tend to, because they tend to be closer to like the CIA, they tend to use those kind of narratives. Like Julian Assange is not even called a journalist, right? He's not considered.
He's a cyber terrorist.
Arbiter. Exactly. He's not a legitimate arbiter of free speech. He's a criminal. And so I think that really speaks to how, he's a criminal, he's a racist, he was with Trump, all of this stuff just helps delegitimize Assange and anybody who follows in his footsteps, which is literally all of us, anyone who's challenging the establishment, because whether you're leaking, whether you're trying to get information out that's being held in direct, out of the public eye, like Julian Assange and WikiLeaks is doing, whether you're doing analysis, whether you're doing independent investigation, it all falls under the same framework of trying to get the truth to the people so they can behave and however they want to behave with that information. And that's kind of the definition of journalism. So I think all of this is very indicative of how there was never really any free speech in the United States, and now it's just more apparent and even more egregiously exposed for all to see, domestically and globally.
So I know we're running out of time. I did just want to also talk about third parties briefly, because this is something I've always kind of been interested in, honestly, is just folks who are willing to break out of the two-party system and try to organize politically outside of the Republican and Democratic parties. One thing that I covered on my show during the 2020 election was Howie Hawkins, when I interviewed him, adopting a lot of these imperialist talking points that we're talking about in regards to Julian Assange, Syria, Russiagate, and that was very disillusioning. And then I went on to kind of find out about how the nomination process within the Green Party was being basically rigged, and any other person who ran in the 2020 nomination, the Green Party would say the same thing. But I guess I'm just wondering, because there are other alternatives. There's the People's Party that's being formed, seemingly, and they have a lot of pretty well-known people who've been involved with them and spoke at an event that they had last year. And obviously there's a lot of different socialist parties throughout the United States. Do you think that it's worth supporting any of these third parties, or is just electoral politics just such a distraction that we should be focusing on organizing a general strike?
Well, that's a very good question. I would say in this moment of retreat, like, I don't think anyone should abandon the electoral arena, so to speak. Like, we have to be engaged somewhat. It doesn't mean voting. It doesn't, we have to be engaged, of course, in it, because so many people pay attention to it. And so I don't see, if people are becoming engaged in the political process and see these parties as an avenue to try and channel their activity, harness it, learn, continue to figure out how to struggle. Like, I don't see any of them, the Green Party, People's Party, wherever you want to go. I think it's, important. You've done some important work on the contradictions of these parties. And so, you're going to run into that everywhere, because, this movement is trying to figure things out. And, it just so happens that oftentimes in movements, things like opportunism, I don't even want to call them human qualities, because I'm not trying to lay it at the feet of individuals, but as we're trying to build new formations and new organizations, we're always going to run into very old ways of being, old habits. And this goes for both, whether it's electoral organizing or a broader political organizing in anything, whether you're doing issue-based campaigns, whether you're in like a communist party. No matter where you go, you're going to deal with these contradictions internally. And I think it's always worthwhile to engage in that. But for me, I think in terms of the future, like where we should be focusing most of our energies, I do see it more so. And I know some disagree with me. I know some people have said, that we're kind of at this point where people support progressive policies. So now we just need to pressure the politicians to do it. I see this fact that we don't have the ability to pressure these politicians right now. And so we need to build an organizational capacity to do that. I don't necessarily think third parties, because their focus is so set on electoral politics, can do that, because it takes a lot of energy to organize in elections and then oftentimes lose them because the system is rigged against you. So we also need alternative formations. I think, of course, a general strike is a great focus, but if we're going to be focusing on a strike, then we need to also go down to the minutia of, okay, how do we organize workers to support such a thing, to be engaged in such a thing? What does that look like? So these are more difficult questions that will take more, I guess, mass-based organizing. And
well, like, how did something like Occupy Wall Street happen? Like, that was pretty spontaneous, right? That was, David Graeber and a bunch of other folks going down to Wall Street and camping out. Like, can't things like that happen? That something like that seems pretty easy. Like,
oh yeah, no, I think that whatever it is, I mean, Occupy Wall Street's a good model. And then Occupy Wall Street then had to deal with the organizational question, because not only was there a lot of state repression, but there was a lot of different political forces coming to Occupy across the spectrum politically. And so there was a lot of back and forth among liberals, among libertarians, among the left of the left, the radical left. And so figuring out organizationally how to sustain something like an Occupy in the future. I don't know if it'll look like an Occupy, if it'll be something else. But whenever there is this impetus to really take direct action on something, that action then needs to be followed up with, okay, how do we sustain this organizationally? How do we make it so it doesn't just become a moment, even if it is an influential one that influences things down the line? I think a sustained, organized mass movement needs to have that element of figuring out where and how we organize around the things that we want. And so I think that there's just so many opportunities to do that because conditions are so dire. But it also just so happens that the political atmosphere in the US happens to also be in its own kind of crisis, because the legitimacy of the system is at such a low point that there is, I think, kind of this stasis, this staleness, this stagnation happening politically. So how we get that critical mass, similar to a Occupy, to confront, I think that's the next stage, is to confront something like the Democratic Party will be the next step. And it's one that hopefully, as this process continues to play out, as the system continues to decay, we see more people saying, yeah, no, we need to confront them, but we can't just elect somebody like AOC or Bernie Sanders to get the job done. And so that will start at the point of organizing on a mass basis and our journalism reflecting and pushing people to think about that. Because the more that we do that, and I think a lot of the criticism, a lot of the sentiment, there was a little bit more of I think an environment that was friendly to independent media around the time after the economic crisis into Occupy, that helped push Occupy into being, similar to how Black Lives Matter, these rebellions, these protests were really sparked by people who were already pushing this narrative, and people were just, they were kind of sitting on a pressure cooker ready to take action. So our work needs to reflect that and help support that and help generate that kind of consciousness that leads to that kind of action.
When you talk about like building a movement, that is coherent and that has a structure, I mean, is there anything that currently exists that we can build off of? Again, because I look at different institutions in the left, whether that be large labor movement, large unions, or again, political parties like the Green Party, and probably other socialist parties as well. I believe at least one of the communist parties is pretty close with the Democratic Party, and the DSA, for example. Like, it just seems that there's so many different elements in the left that are co-opted. Are there any structures already there, or really it just has to be completely kind of built from the ground up?
Well, I think it would be a combination of both, in the sense that all that exists now, no matter how co-opted they are, do have folks who want genuine political change. They want to be fighting for, a new system, a new world, whatever it is. And so we need to engage with that. And so I think that those in DSA, PSL, there's a lot of communist socialist parties out there that we need to work with. We need to, we need to build, we need to engage with, that will form, folks out of there will form, maybe not their leaders, maybe not everyone, but there are folks who will form kind of this basis of a mass movement at the leadership level. And then, yes, we will need to think about from the ground up. Like, I think a lot of us who do journalism and analysis, we are trying to figure out how to create our own institutions. And I think we haven't figured out how to do that yet, where we are connected and we are acting in solidarity beyond our relative similarities and positions and takes and analysis and investigations, but more so like coordinating together, pooling resources, coordinating together, creating independent institutions. We haven't figured that out yet in the journalism side. And I think that same reality is reflected on the mass movement side, in the sense that we have these existing institutions that we need to engage with. We can't abandon the labor movement, no matter how co-opted the leadership in power is in most of the major unions. We can't also abandon completely or just ignore the DSA or any of the socialist parties just because their politics oftentimes veer and are pulled in the direction of the Democratic Party. We still need to figure out how to engage with that. And out of that engagement can come, folks who are willing to do something else. Because I think oftentimes what happens in political parties, socialist parties, organizing efforts is that the experience of loss, the experience of retreat often leads to then a search, right? We've all been there, right? We engage politically in something and then we say, damn, the contradictions of this are stifling, whether it's the anti-war movement in the early 2000s. For me, it was the anti-racist movement, racist policing, all of that, the Obama era. And then we say, we need to do something else. And that propels us to figure it out. And so I think the more we can encourage that and engage in that process, the better off we'll be. And the more we will see people, we have people doing this. We have, there are some great organizations, community movement builders in the South. We have organizations trying to free political prisoners, like the Jericho movement. We have people who are doing real work. We have people fighting for Medicare for all, trying to build a grassroots movement, the Medicare for all movement. But it really is, I think, about how do we then pool our resources together, connect, we got to unite the advanced first. We have to be able to unite with and work with those who are already where we are at in a coordinated and organized manner. And I think that's how mass movements really do begin. And then it's when the spontaneity of the people, when that happens, because it does happen, the people rebel, people protest, then we're prepared to build something out of that rather than it putter out like we've seen so many times, even just in the last, 7 years, 8
Yeah,
years.
I mean, and I guess that's my fear is, when you have the people in these institutions gently, slowly steering you towards the Democratic Party. Like, I remember going to anti-war protests throughout the mid 2000s, and some of them were pretty radical and revolutionary. You had some anarchist folks out there who were pretty direct in confronting the police and whatnot. And you had just a lot of normal people showing up at these protests, making clear that they did not support the Iraq War, that they would be against the invasion of Iran or Syria as well. But then slowly over time, you started seeing, one Democratic politician show up, then you start seeing other Democratic politicians show up, then you start having the Democratic Party, adopting some of this rhetoric, like, oh, if you elect us in 2006, then we're going to get out of Iraq. Then you have the election of Barack Obama, and you have all this energy that's built from the ground up, that getting sucked into the Democratic Party, and then having the Democratic Party diffuse it. And again, you said this: the Democratic Party is a graveyard of all these different political movements. So how do we avoid that? I guess is the question. And again, if you have these different institutions who seem beholden to the Democratic Party, or who can make the argument that, oh, well, there's well-meaning folks within the Democratic Party, and we should be working with them as well. Like, how do you avoid the same thing happening to a new movement?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a difficult question because the only way we can avoid it is by confronting the problem. And so for me, it really is about those of us who are there. We need to be prepared to confront that problem. I do think that means that we will have to engage with some of these organizations, depending on what we do. Not all of us are going to be organizing at the ground level, but some of us will be. And so those of us who are listeners of people like us, go into these organizations and have that debate. The same goes for us, is if we are not necessarily in these organizations or in these movements directly, or we're covering them, if we are on the front lines, asking these questions and ensuring that we do so in a way, especially because we have to discern contradictions of the people and the establishment. So coming to people and addressing people in a way that seeks to win them over is a lot more preferable at the grassroots level than like how we treat the establishment. I think learning the kind of approach of, going after the establishment, ensuring that overall analysis is there, that the truth behind these institutions like the Democratic Party is there. And then at the level of the people, bringing them over to that way of thinking, and with the intention that will shape their behavior, and that will shape their behavior within these organizations and create the necessary atmosphere and climate to make it much more difficult for new movements and uprisings that do arise to take the same overall trajectory. There have been, even in the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, there's a lot of much more marginal forces that weren't getting attention, people that were literally like being disappeared, who were not peddling the Democratic Party line. But then you had at the level of this leadership that was promoted at the level of now it's called the Global Network, I think, Black Lives Matter Global Network. Then it was just the Black Lives Network. You had those folks kind of inching ever so slowly, but very assuredly towards the Democratic Party. And we've seen the results, right? The organizers that are still on the ground trying to do their thing at the grassroots level, they don't get coverage, they don't get attention. Their impact is kind of siloed, while the leadership still, is able to get the media coverage, is able to get the attention, is able to be the kind of the popular face. I even saw a video of Kyle Klinsky claiming that DeRay McKesson's Campaign Zero was the leadership, the true leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement. I was like, what are you talking about? Like, this guy is like a corporate charter school grifter, Aspid Institute, hobnobbing, blue vest wearing, literal agent of the establishment. And that is what's claimed as like the overall leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement, when we know that the reality is a lot more complicated. So it is about how do we elevate and push those voices and encourage those voices outside of the establishment to unite, to engage in their organizations, to engage in these contradictions in a confrontational manner, because that's what we need. That's how people learn. Only through conflict, confrontation, class struggle, so to speak, does the message, right, our message, the truth of the situation really take hold among large numbers of people. Our impact, of course, is great just by doing journalism, independent journalism, but it's even greater when this message really reaches the realm of that struggle.
And I know we went a little longer than I said we would. I forgot to ask at the beginning, and I just mentioned David Graeber. Did you ever read his book Bullshit Jobs?
I have not, but I've read excerpts of it. It's very good.
Yeah, it's a great book. I recommend it. He talks about how I believe it's 40 to 50% of workers say that their job is pointless and they essentially don't do anything, and obviously don't find meaning. And I'd imagine probably more than 50% of people would probably say they don't find meaning in their jobs. But yeah, Danny, if you have a minute, I just had one patron question for you.
Sure thing.
So Primo Radical patrons, for just $1 a month, they can submit questions to all of my guests. And again, folks, I would really appreciate the support now more than ever, now that I quit my job. So if you can give anything at all, please go to patreon.com/Primo Radical. And ask any question you want. This is a somewhat confrontational question, Danny. So it's also a little long, so forgive me as I stumble over this. But it says, what academic sources does Haiphong rely on for his understanding of Chinese social and economic realities today? I ask because, having lived and worked in China for the past 25 years, earned my degree 40 years ago studying China and Japan, reading and speaking Chinese at university level, and having engaged in left politics for the past decade here in Greater China in the International Socialist Alternative China section, I can affirm that all I have heard from him is propaganda gleaned from a 2-week Potemkin visit to China. China isn't just capitalist, it's hyper-capitalistic and hyper-exploitative of the Chinese working masses. There is no social safety net, no free education nor healthcare. And Xi Jinping's line about the Cultural Revolution 2.0 amounts to, if you're not in my clique, pay up to the party or face trumped up charges. Yes, the crimes of US imperialism post-World War II are far more numerous than those of the CCP. But since when do socialists lionize a lesser evil, brutal dictatorship? So a little
yeah, well, I could say, I'm not going to question this person's credentials because I don't know them, but I too have sources in China who are Americans, Chinese, who have lived there for a long time, work there, and they have a different view. So what we are really running into is just a difference of opinion, because a lot of the things that the questioner stated about the anti-corruption campaign in China simply doesn't hold weight. I mean, we've seen how the anti-corruption campaign has been very effective in China. It has clamped down on a lot of the very forces that this person says that they're concerned with, right? That this hyper-capitalism, China's anti-corruption campaign, regardless of what you think of it, regardless of mistakes that have been made, has had a very positive impact on a lot of ways recently with educational reforms, which like literally abolished homework for many of the early grades and has completely eradicated this predatory private tutoring system, which was creating inequality in the education system, where people who could afford this private tutoring, their kids were able to rise above the general competition and leaving a lot of people behind. And so in my opinion, that's a very positive thing. So there's many sides, I think, to the policies that the questioner speaks of. But my sources, they happen to be both in China, and I do read Chinese academic sources. You know, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences has a lot of good work talking about the ideological and political realities of China. Same goes, I do read Chinese media because you have to. If you're going to understand China, you have to read its media. Just same goes with Russia. Same goes with Iran or any country under siege from U.S. imperialism. You have to read what they're saying and you have to understand it. And so, you know, I have contacts in China. I have multiple American friends. Next week, I'm going to be doing a live stream with 2 Black Americans who live in China, one of which has lived in China for many, many years. And they're going to talk about their experiences there and what it's like to be a Black person in China. And I think, you know, there's a lot of propaganda about China. And there's also, you know, China is not the perfect society, and China, and not even its highest of leadership claims that, right? Very proud of achievements. Most Chinese people, 95% of Chinese people are happy with the way that their government is running. But when I was there, a lot of them also had criticisms, right? I also had criticisms of how the government functioned, because there is no pure system. And so I think it's just important for me and how I do my work on China to first and foremost oppose imperialism, but also to reflect, it's very important to do this as Americans, to reflect the will of Chinese people. And if 90+% of Chinese people are happy with their government, I am not going to focus my energy on peddling propaganda that the US media, the State Department, think tanks like the Wilson Center, or like folks like Adrian Zenz populate the airwaves with around so-called human rights abuses. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to focus on what, you know, if I'm going to cover China, what is China doing? What is their country trying to accomplish? And I think that has a very positive impact on easing tensions and countering what is a very dangerous trend, which is more and more Americans being primed for a war with China. And so I would just urge the person in the question to maybe, I don't know if they go out much if they're in China right now, but to do more research, hear more what people have to say, understand the great changes that have happened in China that are just beyond opinion. Like you can't, you know, the elimination of extreme poverty, for example, last year during a pandemic, that achievement is extremely significant. You know, he said no universal healthcare, but 95% of people do have access to basic healthcare, and that's going to be 100% soon. You know, these are achievements that, given where China was in 1949, signal great progress. So I think it's important, if you live, especially if you live in China, or if you live significantly in for periods of time in China, to really learn from the people there and learn from their process and their system, which they support. And the same goes for anywhere else. You know, most people in Syria support their government. Learn why. It happens that they have been very forthright in fighting imperialism and defending the country from imperialism. Same goes in Venezuela, Nicaragua. Find out why these countries are supported by their people in vast majorities. You can always find minority opinion that is usually elevated in the corporate media, that's usually elevated in the US media. So, I mean, that's all I have to say. That I think it's a very interesting question, and I appreciate you bringing it.
Yeah, on that last note, there was actually a, I guess NBC or CNBC, they put up a photo of Cubans marching for freedom, and one of the people in the crowd there was the president of Cuba. So it just goes to show how things are manipulated in the US press. But just to follow up on that last, because you know, from a Marxist perspective, from a leftist perspective, one criticism that I have heard of China, of Vietnam, of Laos, is that while they purport to be socialist countries and have communist parties in charge, that they're really not socialist countries and that they are capitalist. So again, just from like a Marxist perspective, do you think that China and these other countries are moving more towards socialism, or are they becoming more capitalist?
Well, I think there's a confusion often of what socialism is. So a lot of folks, especially who consider themselves Marxists in the US or in the West, they consider socialism to be this kind of like pure form of worker ownership where there is no private forms of economic activity, right? There's kind of like this abolition of the market. It's kind of similar to like abolitionism, like abolish the prison system thinking. It's like, uh, yes, but there are some certain realities that you have to take into account, like where are you going to put the criminals, like the real criminals, the war criminals, the capitalists. You got to have some kind of system for that. And also, you have to also tend to the needs of people who are worried about their so-called public safety. So then that's why I support things like, of course, I want to see prisons abolished, but community control of the police is a really interesting way and a very concrete way of getting there. And so if we look at socialism now, so if you have a socialist revolution like you had in China or Cuba, for example, now that you have this worker state, this state that purportedly led by a communist party, it says we are working in the interest of workers, poor people, peasants, and we're going to shape society in that way to meet their needs. Well, in China, there was, just like in Cuba too, there's this immense underdevelopment, like poverty, an intense level of poverty in the what we call the productive forces. So the ability to produce literal like out of the resources that you have and that you trade with, to be able to produce things, that was at such a low level. It had been super exploited by foreign imperialists, and a lot of the wealth was being siphoned out of the country. And this is a reality that faces much of humanity, China being a quarter of it. But much of the global South faces a very similar situation of imperialists siphoning things out. So in 1978, China made a political decision, an economic decision, that the best way to build socialism, and this was from Marxist doctrine, understanding the various stages of the socialist process, the phases to communism, right? That kind of similar to how the Soviet Union implemented a new economic policy during the war years when poverty was just incredible. World War I, all of that had decimated Russia. Poverty was at the sense of there was a need to institute a market economy, that certain levels of private ownership to spur productivity had to be implemented. And so what China has done is it's kept what's called the commanding heights, the major resources, the energy sector, the transportation sector, large sections of the healthcare sector, right? These sort of commanding heights of the economy remain in public control, while certain levels of private ownership, private capital has been allowed to fester, has been allowed to grow, in the interest of ensuring that China has the requisite economic growth so that it can reach a stage where 1.4 billion people can have what they need, right? That they can produce the goods that they need. That's why a lot of the private capital is in the consumer sector. It's in the goods sectors. It's in the, there's some in the tech sector, but mostly in the consumer goods, not necessarily in the level of production. A lot of high tech in China is state-owned too. So that, I think, is really the model of socialism that China is embarking on. And it has evidence of effectiveness in Laos and Vietnam too, because both of those countries have seen extreme poverty lessen as they've implemented these reforms. And they did have to come with some sacrifices. So for example, as the questioner raised, there wasn't universal healthcare in China. There hasn't been over the last 40 or so years. That has been gradually addressed, given that when you do let private capital in, there are contradictions that occur. And that's why under socialism, you still have class struggle. You still have to manage what the old system left you in a way that's able to address real concrete problems. And I think the problem with a lot of criticisms of China is that it usually comes from people who don't have that experience and who aren't really willing to study it. So if you study the experience of reform and opening up in China, you see that there's two sides to it. There is this growth in like income inequality, for example, which is acknowledged officially as a major problem in the society. But then you have also this massive improvement in the standards of living of all people in China. the reduction of poverty, and also the development of cost-effective, very cheap, if not universal, infrastructure like public transportation and high-speed rail. Like none of that would be possible under capitalism. And we've seen how it's not possible under capitalism, because even countries that have it way behind now, like France, for example, high-speed rail, it's being decimated, right? It's being rolled back. And that's because the impetus towards socialism in like France has been way rolled back, right? The workers' movements have been crushed. Macron is going on a complete assault of the very movements that forced the ruling class there to even just have this modicum of certain advances in public services. While in China, the opposite is happening. In China, there was a situation of colonial underdevelopment, and there had to be a mechanism from which China could access the technology, access the resources that it needs. It's like, I think like more than half of China is land poor, meaning that the land, it's not arable. You can't, so there had to be a way to mechanize the agriculture, and you need access to the market to do that. You need to operate within the world market to do that, or, you basically reinforce the very sanctions that the US had China on for 22 years after 1949. You just reimpose that on yourself because you're isolating yourself from the global economy, and that's just something that's not sustainable for any socialist country. It wasn't sustainable for the Soviet Union, and the US
wasn't opening up like a contributing factor to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fact that they did open up to the West?
I mean, perestroika, I would say it was a lot different. It was an opening up that allowed those forces control over the political sort of direction of the country, which is in China is just not the case. In China, the Communist Party is very firm, and this anti-corruption campaign has been a lot about holding accountable those officials that have been taken by these kind of neoliberal both politics and policy orientations. So in the Soviet Union, it was a combination of things. The Soviet Union is a very big question. There's so many reasons why the collapse happened, but I think first and foremost, what led to political stagnation in the Soviet Union was, I think, first, all of the war, the damaging conditions that 2 world wars left the Soviet Union, the fact that it was isolated heavily by the West and the United States. And so there was an impetus in the Soviet Union to kind of collectivize everything, kind of have public everything. And that also created political problems in the sense that, without certain incentives, without motivation, without political kind of debate, there is the risk of stagnation, a lack of excitement, a lack of enthusiasm about the direction of the country when you're not able to access the wealth and the goods that are, literally being, pushed, sanctioned from you by the outside. And so that, I think, allowed for certain elements of the Communist Party leadership in the Soviet Union to then be very attracted to the idea of opening up, which was more so like moving towards full-scale privatization, which in China is not the case. China says over and over again that we're learning the lessons from the Soviet Union, that our reform and opening up is about the overall development of socialism, not a negation of it. And one of the biggest mistakes that the Soviet Union made was under Khrushchev, when he attacked the Communist Party in the secret speech, where he condemned Stalin and condemned, the Communist Party's behavior. That began, I think, this kind of process of unraveling the legitimacy of the leadership of the party, which then allowed for, like more Western electoralism and Western ways of thinking to gain more credibility inside of the party. Where in China, there's a tight process of ensuring that, the Communist Party's leadership is legitimate. And that both comes from popular support from people. It is 90 million people. I think it's the biggest ruling party in the world. But it also comes from the fact that the the leadership of the Communist Party is not denigrated. It's not slandered, right? Because when you slander the leadership of a country, you make it vulnerable to external forces, which I think happened, unfortunately, in the Soviet Union.
Well, Danny, I really do appreciate you going so long on this interview today. Sorry, hope I wasn't disrespectful of your time. But for folks out there who would like to support you and stay up to date with you, how can they do that?
Sure. So, I write weekly for Black Agenda Report, generally weekly, and I contribute to other sources, Mint Press. But follow me on Twitter at Spirit of Ho, Spirit of Ho. That's the best way to follow just what I'm doing, what I'm thinking about, what I'm talking about. And then, if you can't support me, financially at any amount, patreon.com/Danny Haiphong is the best way to find me. And please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, Black Agenda Report Presents the Left Lens, where I also host like a solo program, the Internationalist Transmission, and a co-hosted program with Margaret Kimberly at Black Agenda Report.
Well, Danny, thanks again. I really do appreciate your time today, and hopefully I can have you back at some point in the future.
Sure thing. Thank you.